Hello and welcome to the National Press Club and to another edition of the Kalb Report. I'm Marvin Kalb. Our program tonight we're calling Guardians of the Fourth Estate, and our guardians are our guests. Dean Baquet, the executive editor of the New York Times, and Martin Barron, the executive editor of the Washington Post. Arguably the two most influential editors of the two most influential newspapers in the country. Dean Baquet has been in this job since 2014, having earlier served as managing editor and Washington bureau chief of the Times. He also edited the Los Angeles Times, won a Pulitzer Prize for his reporting for the Chicago Tribune, and started his newspaper career way back when as a young journalist at the Times-Picayune in New Orleans. Martin Barron, Marty to most of his friends, joined the Washington Post in 2013 after 11 years editing the Boston Globe. Both papers, under his leadership, harvested 12 Pulitzer Prizes. Barron also in earlier times helped edit the Los Angeles Times, the New York Times, and the Miami Herald. Allow me to start our discussion tonight with a simple proposition that in a democracy such as ours, if freedom of the press is jeopardized, then democracy itself is jeopardized, since one is intimately linked to the other. During the presidential campaign of 2016, candidate Donald Trump routinely criticized the press or the media, humiliating a number of reporters, bullying others, challenging the very concept of freedom of the press as written into the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. Many said this was all campaign talk. If he won, this would inevitably change. That is the way it has always been. Well, he won, and it has not changed. Indeed, it has gotten much worse, even on occasion frightening. And I use that word deliberately. The word of a president is much more consequential than the word of a candidate. I know that other presidents have had their quarrels with the media, but Donald Trump crossed a bright red line when he accused reporters of being the enemies of the American people, forgetting that that phrase was a favorite of many 20th century dictators. And Trump has gone further, warning that he might change libel laws, that reporters might have to reveal their sources on sensitive national security stories or risk imprisonment, even warning networks such as NBC that their licenses to broadcast may be revoked if their news stories displease the White House, stories called fake news. What is President Trump seeking to accomplish in this running war with the media? And what should the press's response really be? So, Dean, Marty, welcome. Good to have you both with us. How does one cover a President Trump in a wild era of expanding digital horizons? How do you do that without, at the same time, perhaps undercutting your own traditional standards of mainstream journalism? Dean, start us, please.
First off, you hold on to your standards of journalism. I mean, I think there are bedrock standards which are the obvious ones. Truth, fairness, that good journalists are aggressive, skeptical. I think you hold on to those things, and obviously you have to cover him, as we would any president, by the way, at a remarkable speed. And with him, you have to dodge the fact that yes, all the things you opened up with are true. I mean, I think that he has sought to undermine the press. And I think that's an attempt to appeal to his base by making the press look like it's not fair and by turning the press sort of into a punching bag. I think over the long haul, if you tell the truth, if you're accurate, if you're aggressive and you're fair and you hold on to your principles, I think in the end, that's the only way you can cover him.
Marty, I'm sure you agree with all of that.
Yeah.
But the question that I'm trying to get at, is this president has a way, a very skillful way, of dominating the environment. He's all over the place.
Sure.
And he does that with his tweets, he does that with his personality, his style. How do you keep up with that kind of domination of the environment? Do you have enough reporters? Do you have to stick to your basic rules, as Dean was saying before, and still be able to cover him?
Well, I think so. I mean, I agree with Dean. I think that, look, we have new ways of publishing. We publish at a greater speed. We publish not just 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, but now we have to publish immediately. People expect to get their news immediately, typically on their cell phone, the instant that it happens. That all poses challenges to us. But we still have our values. We still have our mission. That remains the same. And, you know, every day when I walk into our newsroom, we have the principles of the Washington Post on the wall facing me. And the very first principle, which has been around there for more than 8 decades, and that is to tell the truth as nearly as the truth may be ascertained. And, you know, there's a sense of striving there because the truth may be elusive, can be elusive, but it says that there is such a thing as the truth. It's not just a matter of personal opinion. There is a truth, and our job is to come in every day, do our work, and try to determine the truth. And that is exactly what we do. It's nothing fancy. It's our work, the same work that we've been doing for decades.
You use the word truth. This is a president who has been violating the truth almost on a daily basis. We use the word lie now routinely to describe many of the things that a president of the United States is saying. Now, you have your standards, and in my judgment, they're the right standards. But how do you maintain them when the man you're covering isn't dealing with the truth on many occasions, Dean?
You know, I actually chose to use the word lie on the front page of the New York Times, which was a controversial decision in our newsroom, and I actually think that a lot of thoughtful editors would disagree with it. But we don't do it all the time. We did it that one time. I think the way you cover him is if he says X and if it's wrong, you report out Y. I think one thing Marty said is true. I think you report aggressively, and I think you sort of lay out the facts. I think that's what we've been doing since I started as a reporter in 1977. I don't think it's different. I think it's faster. I think it's even more aggressive. We have done things, newspapers have done things like set up whole truth squad operations. We no longer wait the way we did when I started for 2 or 3 days to evaluate whether a politician is telling the truth. We try to do it immediately. We set up systems to do it immediately. On the other hand, I have to say, it's sometimes easier to check things today. I mean, the internet may have perils, but it also has great gifts.
It's hard to check a lie that quickly, isn't it?
You know, if the president says that he cut a program by $500 million, I don't think that's
No, that's easy.
That's easy, and that's actually 90% of the things I think you're talking about. That's sort of easy. You just challenge them and you report them out and you lay it out.
Marty, when the president dismisses some of your best reporting as fake news, and when, according to many polls, from 30 to 40% of the American people are buying into that description, how do you deal with that? How do you fight back?
Look, we do our job. That's
No,
it.
but that's
I mean, I don't think it's too facile. I'm sorry. I realize that you're, looking for something more, but I don't think that there's a lot more to it. Every day, look, the president, on his first day in office, he went to the CIA headquarters and he said, I have a war with the press. And the reality is, we don't have a war with him. We're not at war, we're at work. We're doing our jobs every day the same way that we've always done it. You talk about fact-checking. We've had a fact-checker at the Washington Post for a long time, well before the Trump administration. In fact, we doubled the size. We added an extra person. We have 2 people now doing it. And they've been doing fact-checks for a long time. They happen to be a little busier these days than they were in the past, I have to say. But they're doing the same sort of work every single day. And the very fact that the president is attacking us doesn't change things. We can't just be reactive to that. We have to go out, gather the facts, provide the context, do it in an honorable and honest way, and that's what we endeavor to do every single day.
What is then different about covering Trump?
Well, it's a more hostile environment. There's no question about that. He was attacking us during the campaign regularly, even withdrew press credentials from the Washington Post during the primary and then for a time during the general election as well. And he condemned us. He sought to he condemned us. He sought to delegitimize us. He even dehumanized us, calling us the scum and garbage, the lowest form of humanity. And then when that wasn't enough, he called us the lowest form of life itself. He sought to dehumanize us. And so that's different. He's also threatened us in the way of sort of talking about the possibility of litigation against us, suggesting, as has been reported by us in the New York Times, in his conversations with the former FBI director, the prospect of wanting to send some reporters to jail for leaks, particularly for classified information leaks. So, this is what's different. It's a more threatening and more hostile environment.
You know that.
If I can add,
go ahead, Dean. I'm sorry.
I agree with Marty. If I can add, it's also a significant shift in the culture of Washington. There's always been a tense relationship between. It's a myth that. I was the Washington bureau chief of the New York Times for 5 years, and I never met Barack Obama the entire time I was the Washington bureau chief. There was a notion that papers like the Post and the New York Times had a cozier relationship. I don't actually want to have a cozy relationship with any president. I don't go to the Christmas parties. I don't go to the White House Correspondents' Dinner. I don't think that's but he's turned up the volume, there's no question, on and dramatically changed the culture of Washington. But I actually think, and I know this is not the sexiest answer, but I actually think that calls for us to stick to our principles even more. That calls for us to hold on to sort of the values, the fairness, the toughness, but especially to sort of there are these traditional journalism standards that I think have been threatened in some institutions in the digital age, even before the arrival of Donald Trump. And if anything, I think the last year has been a call to hold on to those and to hold on to them tightly.
Okay, I want to tell you a story. Back in 1947, when Jackie Robinson broke the baseball barrier on color, he still faced a great deal of prejudice, and he got into a lot of fights. And his boss, Branch Rickey, pulled him aside one day and said, "Jackie, don't punch back, just beat them on the field." Turn that into journalism now. How do you adjust to the almost daily taunts and jabs and insults of the president without punching back? You're all making it seem, both of you, as if it's sort of the same, your principles are the same, you don't touch, everything is honky-dory. But it can't be. And how do you not punch back?
You say it can't be, but it can be. This is the thing.
Don't fight me on
is that I am. This is what I'm trying to do here. So I don't think that's true. I think that we've come to expect it. It happens every other day, maybe every day. It's become, to some degree, background music, and it's not pleasant background music, but it's background music. And if we were to react to this every single day, get all worked up about it, and spend our time sort of, making an issue out of it all the time, we wouldn't be able to do our jobs. If that's what he wants to do, that's what he wants to do. We know what we want to do. We want to do our jobs, and that's what we're going to continue to do.
All right, Dean, I know, everybody in this room knows that there are people who argue that the two of you, New York Times and the Washington Post, are in a kind of unseemly competition to topple this president, to pull another Watergate.
Yeah.
And what I would like to know from you is, how do you respond to that kind of criticism, which is not widespread, but it's there?
I would say two things. First, Marty and I are friends, in fact, but we're we have a tremendous. The only competition is between us. It's not a competition to topple the presidency. There is one thing I sincerely believe is that I do agree that the Washington Post and the New York Times are at the forefront of this story right now. I cannot imagine what it would be like if it was only one of us, because it would mean that the other newspaper would be under tremendous pressure. But I will say that one of the most under-discussed and undervalued qualities in journalism that drives much more journalism than anybody realizes is competition. I hate it when I get beat. He hates it when he gets beat. The thought that we could collude to do anything is utterly ridiculous, except obviously we could collude to fight for our values. We could collude to talk about the First Amendment. But the thought that we would be anything other than friendly and admiring but vicious competitors, well, he's vicious, competitors.
Marty, I would like.
You know, Dean has told me about, that I mean, it's better that both of us are in there, but I've invited him to cede the territory to us. So we can test it, see how it goes without the New York Times.
What I would like to get your judgment on, both of you really, is when the president keeps attacking the press, what is his ultimate aim? What is he seeking to accomplish? You said before, playing to his base. Fine. Is that it? Is that all he's trying to accomplish?
Well, I will fall short of psychoanalyzing him, but I think if you looked at Donald Trump's pattern through the campaign, and as president, first off, he clearly goes after his critics, and I think he goes after, in particular, critics and people who have independent standing, which the press certainly does. I mean, he early in his presidency went after the judiciary, and probably, arguably, the most independent and protected entities in society are the judiciary and the press. I think, first off, I think all presidents are really frustrated by the power of the press, by the fact that they can't tell us what to do, by the fact that we push, at our best, we push back at them hard. But I think for a guy who grew up in a world of business, I think it makes him nuts. He's also a guy, by the way, as a New Yorker who grew up manipulating the press. I mean, I think Page 6 was his playground. He, famously announced his divorce on Page 6 before he told one of his wives. I think he arrives in Washington at the pinnacle of it all, and here are these jerks, the press, who push and push and push and do our jobs.
You don't see a larger political purpose,
I mean,
some ideology being served here.
I mean, there's the obvious one, which is that he plays to a base that generally may not believe the press anyway. But I think some of it is personal frustration. I mean, his MO in New York was to manipulate the press, and he got his way with the press, mainly the tabloids.
But is it possible?
So part of it is strategic.
No, I hear you.
But part of it, I think, is just a guy who suddenly finds himself confronting a very different kind of press than he confronted when he lived in the world of tabloid journalism in New York.
Is it possible that by attacking the press, by creating this sense of fake news, by delegitimizing among an X% of the American people what it is that you do for a living, that he may succeed, that at the end of the day, his vision of this all may triumph? Do you think that's possible? And two, what would then happen? What is the price of letting this happen?
Look, I mean, it has a corrosive effect, I think. There's no question about it. He's obviously saying something that appeals to a large segment of the American population. Approval ratings for the press were quite low, have continued to go down over decades. That's true, actually, of most institutions, major institutions in American society. We have the not great distinction of being a little ahead of Congress on that front. But the polls have shown a sharp decline, a significant decline, particularly in the last year, in approval of the presidency as well, to the point where our standing and the presidency's standing are beginning to intersect.
Really?
So, and if you actually look at the polls—
Then you're in trouble.
if you actually look at the polls more recently, we've actually begun to see a little uptick in the standing of the press among the American public. And, people see us doing our work. And my view is that, we have to look at this over the long run. I mean, will the reporting be validated over the long run? If you go back to Watergate, for example, and I'm not making an analogy here, but we had a president at that time who was sharply critical of the press, whose first vice president, Spiro Agnew, before he had resigned, was the designated attack dog, embraced that role. The approval ratings for the press during the Watergate investigation were very low. A huge segment of the American population saw that as a partisan enterprise. And then it turned out that that reporting was validated. And the approval ratings for the press after Nixon's resignation went sharply up to the highest point we've seen, which is not always so high. I mean, maybe the mid-50s is about as high as we'll ever get because we're always going to upset somebody. So I take the long view of this. The reporting needs to be solid. Ultimately, I'm confident that the reporting will be validated over time, and I take the long view of our standing among the American public.
Dean, if trust be lost to whatever degree, how does one reconstitute trust? How do you gain back the confidence of the American people that what you spend an awful lot of time and money doing is valuable, is important? How do you sell that again?
I mean, I may be naive, but I actually think that when the press does its job, and does its job, which is to be an aggressive, questioning watchdog of government, even if it drops, it comes back. Press does its job, Vietnam, Watergate. Press didn't do its job as well, build up to the Iraq War. I think when the press does its job and is aggressive, even if it temporarily loses trust, if it holds on to its values, I think history is filled with examples of where it comes back. I just think as long as you get it right, as long as you stand up to power, as long as you aggressively question, as long as you hold on to all of that, I just don't think you lose. And I think history is behind us on that.
And you don't feel, neither one of you, that the combination of presidential taunt, perhaps actual action against you, an atmosphere that gets clouded with doubt and suspicion, that is a tough thing to fight.
Action makes me more nervous because we haven't gotten into the realm of action. I mean, if this White House, for instance, remember, the last White House was not so nice to the press when it came to leak investigations. If this White House chose to be more aggressive, that would be bad, and that would be something we would have to fight. If this president, I'm not sure I buy the licensing issue, but I think if this president chooses to go after reporters, and Jeff Sessions has said, the Attorney General has said, he has open leak investigations, that makes me more nervous than, I think I'm with Marty. I think the taunts and the tweets have become background music. At a certain point, we would look at them and debate over how to respond. We don't. He did one 2 days ago at us, and we don't even respond anymore.
Well, let me give you a little bit of history before I ask this next question. But when I was covering Lyndon Johnson during the Vietnam War, there were a couple of occasions when he would call me on the phone, yell and curse and accuse me of all kinds of horrors. And when those calls ended, I was a shaken leaf. It was tough. And then during the Nixon administration, I found myself on an enemies list. My office was broken into twice. The phone was tapped. And I worry, do any of your reporters, has anyone checked back to you with anything resembling that kind of activity against the press?
You mean shouting? Shouting,
Not
yes.
the shouting.
Shouting, yes.
Not the shouting.
Not an enemies list or anything like that I'm aware of. But you don't need an enemies list.
Wiretapping?
You're just not aware of anything. No.
So even on the national security stories.
But we wouldn't necessarily, if it were
We wouldn't
occurring,
know. That's
I'm
one
not
of our
supposing that
problems.
it's happened. I don't have any evidence that it is, but we wouldn't know about that.
Okay. Let me just take a minute now to remind our radio, television, and internet watchers, listeners, readers, that this is the Kalb Report. I'm Marvin Kalb, and I'm talking to two of the nation's top editors, Marty Barron of the Washington Post and Dean Baquet of the New York Times. Tell me, what is, Dean, the single biggest challenge to your newspaper today?
Boy, the single biggest challenge?
Yeah.
I think we've gotten past, if you'd asked me that 3 years ago, I might have said, the financial future. I don't feel, that's always a challenge. I don't feel threatened by that anymore. I really don't.
And now?
The single biggest challenge, there are a lot of them. I guess the single biggest challenge is, to my mind, is not just the New York Times. It's whether local news, which I think is in the middle of a crisis, whether the country can survive what I think is going to happen in the next 4 to 5 years, which is I think many local newspapers are going to go out of business. One challenge for me is I believe I have an obligation to make up for at least some of that. I even think I have an obligation to do what I can to even help some of those institutions survive. But if you ask me what's the biggest challenge facing journalism, if I can answer it that way, it's the inevitable decline and death of some of great local news organizations.
Marty, your sense, please?
My sense is that it's people have a very difficult time these days distinguishing what is true and what is not true. They're drawn to sources of information that affirm their pre-existing point of view, not just in terms of opinion, but they'll accept so-called information and so-called news that's coming from media outlets that deliberately spread false information and crackpot conspiracy theories. And people are open to those because somehow it conforms to their view of the world. And that's concerning because now we have a society. It used to be that we would disagree, and we should disagree, on policies and sort of what the analysis of events is, what the interpretation is, and what the prescription for solving our problems are. But we would agree on a baseline set of facts. We could actually agree on what happened yesterday. We could disagree about what to do about it. But now we can't even agree on what happened yesterday. And I think that is not just a challenge for the press, but a challenge for democracy. Because how do you have a healthy democracy and a well-functioning civil society if we cannot even agree on a baseline set of facts?
I almost feel like I have to go back to the first question I asked you, which is if you are dealing with a president who attempts to build up the concept of fake news, that only worsens your problem, right?
Oh, absolutely, no question.
And how does a newspaper today, you run the two biggest, best newspapers in the country, that is a huge problem, totally agree with you. How do you deal with it? What do you deal with? When you say, what I want to do is I want aggressive reporting, I want us to be honest, word this, that, and the other. Those are words. They are words of great importance, but is that it?
Well, there's a limit to what we can do. We don't have total power, obviously. So, contrary to what sometimes people say about us, we do have to do our jobs the way that we see them. But also, I think we can be more transparent about how we go about our work. Talk more about who we are and what we believe and how we go about our work. That's why we're here.
You're here.
We can tell people more about the backgrounds of the people who write for us and produce video for us and do our graphics and all of that. I think people are entitled to know who we are. They're entitled to know how to reach us. We can show more of the documents that we depend on in doing our reporting. We can disclose more, perhaps full transcripts or full audio of interviews that we've conducted. We can just be more open about that, and I think that would help. I don't pretend that that's going to entirely do the job, but it won't hurt, that's for sure, and it could help.
In fact, I think it helps a lot. One of the shocks to me when I was the editor of the LA Times is that we we did a focus group, and people didn't, to my horror, people didn't know what datelines were. So if a story said, you know, the name Alyssa Rubin and it said Kabul, they thought that meant she made a lot of phone calls to Kabul. And I think we need to tell people that, you know, Alyssa Rubin has been covering wars in Afghanistan and Iraq for 20 years. Here's who she is. Here's what she looks like. Here's her background. And I think if you do that, I think our previous era of sort of distance from readers was not good for us. And I think we're learning now, as Marty said, to open the doors.
Dean, you mentioned a moment ago that 2-3 years ago, the financial issue might have been the major problem, but it isn't today. To the best of my knowledge, you've established a foundation in the newsroom to attract money to help you cover the news. How's that doing, by the way, and how much money have you collected?
We literally just started that. That's not why I feel more comfortable with the financial future of the New York Times. That's very brand new. I feel comfortable because over the last year, and this is one thing I would point to the people who say that news organizations like ours are being attacked and discredited. Both of our news organizations have seen dramatic rises in subscribers. I think people want to read strongly reported, well-reported journalism, and I think they're flocking to us.
So Trump has been wonderful for you.
It would depend. That's a complicated answer, but just to finish I think the most for my institution, and I suspect the same is true for Marty's, is the revolution in the economics of the great news organizations like ours is that suddenly we are much more dependent on readers than ever before. We're more dependent on readers than advertisers. I think that's just a remarkable and terrific development. I also think it ensures that institutions that are high quality will survive. So I mean, nobody's sanguine, but I'm more sanguine than I was 3 years ago.
Do you still make more money on advertisements in the hard news?
We now make more money on subscribers in print and online than we do in advertising. That's when I started in this business, and I'm sure when 80% of a newspaper's revenue came from advertising. It's not totally reversed, but it's moving in that direction. By the way, to be frank, I would much more want to be dependent on my readers than on advertisers. I think because readers demand quality, they demand all the things we're talking about. I think that's a great development.
Marty, you have an owner with deep pockets, Jeff Bezos. Does that mean that you have no financial problems at the Post?
No. But we're having a very good year for the very reasons that Dean mentioned. We're seeing a dramatic growth in subscribers. Earlier this year, we passed 1 million digital-only subscribers. That's in addition to the people who get digital access with their print newspaper subscription. So that was double what we had at the beginning of the year and triple what we had a year earlier. Wow. So we've seen tremendous growth, and that has had a dramatic impact on our financial picture. It's very beneficial for us, and we're having a quite good year. Jeff's objective is for us to create a sustainable business model for the Washington Post. We're not a charity. He doesn't treat us like a charity. And I'm very glad he doesn't treat us like a charity, because if he were to get tired of this charity, we would be in deep trouble. And what he wants to do is create a sustainable business model that will last for a very long time, many decades.
Have you done that as yet?
Well, as I said, we're having a very good year. Last year was our first profitable year in a very long time. And this year we're doing far better than we did last year.
I was saying a moment ago.
But that's not to say that all the issues are resolved. We still have a lot of things to work on, as does the New York Times. But we're in, as Dean said, the two of us are in better shape than major metropolitan newspapers around the country, and that does remain a huge crisis, the biggest crisis in the press in this country right now, financial crisis in the press.
I was joking before when I asked you whether Trump is good for business, but it occurs to me that maybe, I'm sure you've both thought about this extensively, maybe the reason that the subscription rates are going up is that people want to know more about a president who dominates the news.
Oh, sure.
And that gives you an opportunity to provide answers and insight into this new president.
So I think both of our institutions, both of our institutions were ready to take advantage of it, because frankly, not every news organization has seen the dramatic increases that the Post and the New York Times have seen. I don't think they were in a position. I think people come to us because they know we're covering them aggressively. But if I can say the thing I think Trump has done most, at least for me as a journalist, I think there was a period when newspapers sort of lost a little bit of their confidence. Our economics were more in turmoil. I'm talking about going, several years. Our economics were more in turmoil. There were debates in newsrooms about, not necessarily in the newsrooms, but in newspaper companies and in all news organizations about what did readers want and how do we give readers what they want, which is a very good debate. But debates like that always make you sort of a little anxious. I think that what we learned was they actually want what we do. And I feel more confident as an editor today than I have. I'm a confident guy anyway, but I feel significantly more confident today as an editor and more clear-eyed on what I'm supposed to do than I did 5 years ago.
I would add to that there's been a shift in the thinking among the American public as well. I think the American public took the press for granted for a very, very long time, and that's changed. People don't take the press for granted anymore. They have a better understanding of the role of the press in an American democracy, and I think that has helped us, is that people recognize today that they need quality journalism, and if they don't support quality journalism, by paying a very little amount of money, actually, if they don't support quality journalism, they will not get quality journalism.
But we're talking about quality journalism from two very distinctive news organizations, New York Times and Washington Post. You were mentioning, Dean, about the news organizations in the central part of America. Perhaps you were saying yourself that some of these may have to go out of business.
I think local news is in deep trouble. I think the financial model that the Post and the New York Times have managed their way through, which is the dramatic decline in print advertising, I think that a lot of these newspapers have cut their newsrooms to the point that it's hard for them to charge the kind of money that our news organizations charge. I think that there are entire sections of America that aren't covered. I grew up in a newspaper in New Orleans that is a terrific newspaper. I'm sure the staff is a tiny fraction of what it was. My guess is there are places like Mississippi and Alabama that don't cover their congressional delegations because they don't have Washington bureaus, they don't have Washington correspondents, and unless they're members of Congress or very powerful figures who become national figures. And I think those news organizations are struggling.
So what's the consequence of that?
The consequence of having entire parts of the country not covered by the way, there are other news organizations that will come in to take their place in some cases, but that's not happening yet for the most part. I think that's catastrophic. I think that it means that there are school boards right now making decisions with nobody watching. It means that there are budgets that are getting passed in places where the news organizations their staffs are too small to spend days going through their budget. I already think we're in the middle of a crisis that people have not woken up to.
Marty?
Well, I agree. Look, something like more than half the states the press in the state has no one in Washington actually covering their congressional delegation. Right. Nobody. In most states, perhaps the biggest paper in the state has maybe one or two people covering the state capitol, covering the governor, both houses of the state legislature, all of the government agencies, the politics and the policy, and they're expected maybe to do an investigative piece. It's not even possible to do the basics. There are school boards going uncovered, county commissions going uncovered, city councils going uncovered, a lot of things going uncovered. And forget about the other powerful institutions and powerful individuals in town who should be covered as well. So I think overall it leads to, number one, a lack of accountability, as Dean was making reference to, And I think a degradation in basically civil society at the local and regional and state level. And I think that's hugely concerning because who is going to step in to do that kind of work?
It also means, if I can say, when I was a reporter for the New York Times and spending most of my time in Washington, there was a stretch near the metro where there were like 8 or 9 newspaper boxes with all the regional newspapers.
Oh, yes.
And if you got beat on a story, partly because all of them used wires and partly because a lot of them were competing on the stories, you'd walk past the Post, of course, but then the Sun, the Philadelphia Inquirer, each one was like a kick in the stomach. So by the time you got I got back to the Washington Bureau, I was practically crawling.
Yes.
That's gone. I mean, the regional news organizations that are not, really not factors in this story the way they were.
Let me talk to you for a sec about social media and how journalists are dealing with social media, which, could be a blessing or a curse. I am not at all sure of that. But Dean, you recently announced some new guidelines on the use by your reporters of social media.
Yeah.
Why the concern? Why did you have to do that?
The first thing I should say about all of this, social media, the digital landscape, it's all actually great. I mean, we spend a lot of time as journalists sort of, hand-wringing and debating and of course it's all hard, of course it's all perilous, but the big news organizations like mine have more readers than we ever had because we're just more people can access us. The reason we changed our social media policy was I thought it was too easy.
What did you change it to?
So we've always had a policy that said essentially journalists should not say anything on other platforms and on social media that they wouldn't say in the pages of the New York Times or on our various platforms. But to be frank, we weren't aggressive enough in sort of making it a front and center policy. So we had just announced a front and center policy, and the essence is don't say anything on Twitter or Facebook or any place else that you wouldn't say in the New York Times. Because I think there's an entire generation of journalists. We have encouraged them to have large followings. We've encouraged them to promote their stories. We've encouraged them to find audiences for their stories, and I want them to do all that. But I was worried that there may have been instances where people went too far in expressing their opinions. And we are in a time when the press is being poked by its enemies, pushed to be provocative. By the way, even television news does that. We're in a climate in which everybody wants everybody to say strong stuff, to have strong opinions, and it's really tempting. And what I wanted to do was to make clear that I don't want the temptation to lure any of our people into saying things that I thought were inappropriate.
Fair enough, but I remember when Abe Rosenthal was the editor of the New York Times, he would say that if a Times reporter want to appear on CBS, they can appear on CBS and leave the Times. He wouldn't allow it at all.
Yeah.
You now, you just said it, you want it to get out?
Yeah. That was
It's a publicity thing for you both.
Yes.
But on cable television...
And a transparency thing, too. But go
Okay,
ahead.
but on cable television, when a reporter for the Post, and I've seen many of them and many Times reporters, when you appear on Fox or on MSNBC, the environment itself screams a political point of view. Your reporter is asked to discuss the story that will be in tomorrow's Post. I'm not saying that the reporter goes beyond that. I'm saying that the environment suggests to any logical viewer that that reporter is hooked in with the left or the right. Now, how do you manage that? Can you have it both ways? Can you want the publicity without going along with the cost?
Well, I'm not sure I entirely accept your premise there. I mean, I think that our reporters can behave in a very professional manner in those environments, and that I mean, you're presupposing that just because they're there, they're assumed to have a particular political point of view, which I just
You don't see that at all?
I don't believe that that's the case. You'd have to point me to some specifics for me to look at. Look, I mean, we want our reporters to be out there. We have the people on our staffs. Dean's too, they're authorities in their fields. They've spent a lot of time. They have experience. They have expertise. We want them to share that. We want them to be viewed as authorities, the authorities that they are. And these days, it's helpful if they make proper use of social media, and it's helpful if they're on television and radio, and that's where a lot of viewers are. So we would like to reach them. We would like them to be thinking about, for us, the Washington Post. And I don't think that they necessarily engage in risky behavior simply because they're appearing on the air.
Quite the contrary. I specifically said that I am not at all criticizing the reporters.
And I'm not sure that they're perceived as such, so I would say
Okay, well, let's leave that as a difference.
Can I add one thing?
Yeah.
You said for publicity. It's not just for publicity. Of course, it's to call attention to our news organizations. But I'm in this business to have impact. I want, if I do an investigative if I do an investigative story like the Harvey Weinstein reporting that we just did, I want it to have impact. I want it to be read. I want it to be discussed. I want it to have impact on the world. So yeah, I want the report, and by the way, I want people to meet the reporters who did it. I think people benefited from meeting David Farenthold and seeing he's like a normal, nice guy.
Okay. Journalists
that's
around
David
the world.
Farenthold of the Washington Post. Just to be clear. Just to be clear.
Widening the circle just a minute.
And I feel the same way about the DEA story that we had. So.
Talking seriously for a minute.
Yeah. Do we have to?
We're really serious.
No.
Go ahead.
What I would like to say is that journalists around the world tend to look toward the United States as a beacon for the expression of a free press in its broadest sense. They look toward us for that. And I'm wondering if you think that President Trump's attacks on the press have affected the way other governments deal with their press. Dean?
Well, I want to say one. It's easy for Americans to get so upset about the way Donald Trump attacks us that we forget. We still have these amazing freedoms that other news organizations don't enjoy. We can still write. Neither one of us controls our editorial pages, but our editorial pages tomorrow can say whatever they want to say. I can publish, a 3-part series about anything. He can rail, he can complain, we can cover that, and we can write an analysis about it. We shouldn't kid ourselves. We have remarkable freedom in this country.
I totally agree with that. I want to protect it.
But yes, I do. I think it's almost inevitable, and there's been some reported evidence of it, that if the President of the United States feels comfortable saying the list of despicable things that Marty described that this president has said about journalists, that's got to be empowering to countries that look for excuses to beat up their journalists, and by the way, to beat us up too. It's a little bit hard for me, as we keep making the case to the Chinese government that they should make our website more available, which they shut down after we did an investigative piece, if the President of the United States is trashing us all over the place, that's for sure.
Marty, one of your reporters, Jason Rezaian, who was right here with us tonight, I'm happy to say, was captive in Iran for 544 days. And we're so happy that he is now a free man and a free journalist once again. But how do you editors protect reporters who are in similar, dangerous, very troubling environments?
Well, it's very difficult. We try to take every precaution possible. We try to know where our reporters are at any time. We provide security counseling all along the way. What happened to Jason was horrible, and totally unexpected. It came out of the blue for us. And that's not where we perceived the greatest risk at the time. We're very concerned about reporters who were covering Syria, reporters who were in Iraq, who were in Afghanistan, in places like that. Now, journalists who may be operating in Turkey, because Turkey has actually cracked down on the press, including the foreign press. And so we get concerned about that. journalists who are operating in Mexico, where journalists are assassinated, domestic journalists are assassinated on a regular basis. Journalists in Venezuela, where journalists are imprisoned on a regular basis. So we're concerned about the security of our people who operate in those environments. We do have people who advise us, experts who advise us on security. We keep track of our journalists' movements so that we know where they are.
If one of them was kidnapped and you had a ransom request of $5 million, would you pay it?
Well, these are the hypotheticals that we would never discuss as to what we would do and how we would respond to anything of that sort. We just are not going to. I'm not going to discuss that.
Okay. Okay. One student from the University of Oklahoma, who was with us tonight, asked me to ask you this question. It's a wonderful question. She wanted to know whether we're all going through a kind of temporary phase in our American democracy with President Trump, and that when he leaves office, whenever that be, we'll all return to something that resembles a normal presidency and a normal America. So what do you think about that, Dean?
I don't know, but I would say a couple things. I think that Washington and the press and the government will be different in a post-Trump era. I think that there's no question. I don't think, let's say Donald Trump is president for 8 years. I don't think that the next president comes in and all of the changes that have been made, all of the debates that have been had. And by the way, the one thing I would add, those debates, many of those debates are the reason he was elected. I don't think those debates are there are fierce debates in the country about the role of the media, the role of the elite, the role of the coasts, and those debates are going to still go on. And I think if we pretend that Donald Trump is not a product of those debates, we're going to miss the opportunity to really monitor and understand a discussion that was going on in the country before him, and my guess is will go on after him. He's a byproduct, whatever one thinks of him, and I'm not going to judge him, that's not my job. He is a byproduct of some fierce debates and economic upheavals in America that are not going to go away.
Let me ask each of you a final question, and I'm going to give you, as we say in television terms, 30 seconds to answer it. I want a detailed answer. Seriously, what kind of advice would you give to young journalists in the audience here, or to students who want to go into journalism, given sort of the negativity, whatever, going on today? What would you tell them? What advice? Marty, start.
It's short and sweet. Go into it. Go into journalism. It's a great profession. It's going to have a future. I'm an optimist, actually, notwithstanding the enormous challenges we face. One person, it's a great field. One person can make an enormous difference. Absolutely. One person. And if you want to be the person who can make an enormous difference, it's a great field to go into.
Dean.
This is the greatest time to be a journalist. Look, I grew up in a world where there was one platform, print. I called Max Frankel. I sent Max Frankel a note one day saying, my God, I just ordered up a video. There's no question that the best news organizations are like 1 billion times better than they ever were before, and that the opportunities are greater.
Thank you both very much. I'm afraid that our time is up for now, running out of time. But in closing, forgive me, but I'd like to go back to an earlier point about the relationship of a free press to political authority. And I'd like to say that in my career as a journalist, I spent a lot of time covering the Soviet Union. It was a country at that time governed by communists. They had little taste or understanding of personal freedom, much less press freedom. Everything was determined by the vozhd, the Russian word for the master leader, the guy who ran everything from the Kremlin, who thought he knew more than anyone else, and as a result, everyone from doctors to journalists had to stand up and salute, never rock the boat, never be critical of him or of his policies. I did not like that arbitrary style of governance then, or any version of it, and I don't like it now. What I've learned over the years is that only a free press can truly protect us from authoritarian government. Only a free press can ensure a continuation of a vibrant democracy. The two are inseparable. If a political leader, for whatever reason, finds it to his advantage to attack a free press, to humiliate it, to disparage it, he is really attacking democracy at its core, and that has no place in this country. At least that is my view. Let me now thank our audience here at the National Press Club and all over the world, and especially I want to thank our two editors, Marty Barron of the Washington Post, Dean Baquet of the New York Times, for taking the time to be with us, for sharing their thoughts, ideas, experience with us, and for giving us hope that their leadership will inspire a new generation of reporters to go out there and get the news without fear or favor. But that's it for now. I'm Marvin Kalb, and as Ed Murrow used to say many years ago, good night and good luck. Thank you very much. We now have an opportunity for me to keep quiet and for you to ask questions. And we have two cameras, one there, one there. Please, if you have a question, go to the camera area and I will recognize you. It's right there and right here. And I'll start over here with one young lady. Go ahead, please. Give me your name, ask a question, don't make a speech, or I'll be forced to cut you off, and I don't want to do that. Go ahead.
I'll resist the temptation. First, I'd like to say thank you for your terrific reporting, especially on both the DEA story and the Harvey Weinstein story, especially as a woman, frankly. You both talked about data, okay, and having more data about your readers. By the way, my name is Joan Michelson. I'm with Green Connections Media. But there's a balance here, you know. We have to tell what we need to know, readers what they need to know, which is not always what they want to know. And sometimes they're in conflict. So how do you decide what to cover? I mean, how much of the reader's opinions and desires to take into account so that you don't end up really skewing, you know, not covering things you need to cover and maybe covering too much that's, my opinion, superficial. But how do you decide between what the audience input is?
I would say in the old days of newspapers, we knew nothing about readers. And I think we gave readers sort of what we thought they wanted. And I don't think that was any healthier. I think, in fact, that my guess is, you know, readers had to buy your newspaper, right? You didn't even know what the weather was going to be in the morning if you didn't buy your newspaper. I think that knowing what readers want, as long as you balance it, is better. And I think sometimes people misunderstand the use of data. They think that data is we sort of wake up in the morning and we say, oh my God, the readers love this and they didn't love this, let's change it. 70% of the way we use data is, oh my God, people in Asia want to read a story that's at their time in Asia. Or people tend to want to read, they read longer stories in the evening. I'm just sort of riffing. If they want to read longer stories in the evening, and if I have a story that a reporter has worked on for 6 months and it's a long story, I'm certainly going to put it up in the evening. I like knowing what readers want. It just so happens, I'm fortunate, the readers of the New York Times want what we've been giving them traditionally. I don't think people want the Kardashians from the New York Times. I don't even think we would know how to do that if they wanted that.
They don't even know who they are.
They don't. They don't. That's true. So
The New York Times.
I want to know, and I also, you know, I think it's healthy for me to know that, and I don't think we're going to do anything to chase clicks. But I want to understand my audience. I want to understand when they read. It's important for me to know if, you know, in the print era, we all had this suspicion that people didn't read past the jump. Well, nowadays, if you know people don't read a story of a certain length on a certain day, run it when they'll read it. I think that's fine. I want to be read.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, please.
Hi, Carl Gollivan, domain reference anidealiveson.net. And I'd like to raise a question or concern that is the largest corporate media really to be trusted, that it hasn't been co-opted or guided by the deep state or even the deep church or deep temple as the hand in the glove of the deep state. I would point to, in the 50s, Operation Mockingbird, created by the CIA to actually spend money at the top levels of journalism, as to the Time Life, for example, to kind of keep covered up some of the aspects of the Kennedy assassination, which 50 years later, we're still waiting.
Please ask the question.
This is yours.
Well, I think I am.
No, you're not.
Have either of you heard of Operation Mockingbird, or will you refute the notion that the mainstream media is guided by the deep state? And
I will refute the notion that the mainstream media is guided by the deep state. I bet, and I bet Marty seconds it. I will completely refute that notion. Thank you. Totally.
Marty, you wanna throw
I don't even know where to find the deep
I don't
state.
even know where to begin. I mean, I really don't. I mean, the term deep state, I mean, you're talking about, people who work in government, I guess. Look, I mean, we're just doing our jobs the way that we always have. The idea that there's some sort of hidden hand here is crazy. I mean, the reality is that these days, as we talked about before, a huge amount of our revenues, a growing amount of our revenues are coming from subscribers. The people that we have to satisfy day in and day out are our subscribers. And you know what they want from us? For the most part, is they want the kind of journalism that's traditionally been done, and that is they want investigative reporting, they want honest and honorable journalism, they want deep narratives, they want all of that, and they're willing to pay for it. And you know what guides us? Our subscribers guide us. That's who guides us.
Yeah.
Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Casey Decker. I'm a senior now at GW. My question is about analysis pieces. You both have, I guess, sections like the fix or the upshot, where people who are not columnists, people who are staff writers, provide their own insight. My question is, to what extent do you worry that those kinds of analysis pieces create a slippery slope from objective reporting to outright opinion, especially in a time where people are having a hard time figuring out what is fact?
I mean,
Thank you.
think that's a good question. We work really hard. I mean, the analysis pieces have become much more important. Not only the upshot, but just traditional political analysis is more important today than it was before. And it's harder to do because the traditional daily news story now has to have analysis. Analysis pieces were born in newspapers in an era when the news story was just the facts, and you needed a story that said, when the president does this, he is reaching for a whatever symbol of foreign policy or whatever. But I think those stories we police them, we're careful about them, we slip sometimes. But I think they're really important, and I think they're probably more important than they ever were because they illustrate the expertise of a newsroom, and I think we have to do them. We just have to be careful about them.
Marty, would you like to add something?
Look, it's tricky territory. There's no question about it. It's a good question. What we try to do is that I don't think we should be stenographers. I think what we want to do is we don't want to just report what people say. We want to report what people do, and we also want to explain why it's being done, who it might affect, who's responsible for those decisions, and then you start getting into the territory of analysis.
Right.
One thing that we do is we label it. We actually label it analysis. We label something opinion. We label something, perspective or things like that. And that appears on all of the digital platforms everywhere we are, no matter where it is, whether it's on Snapchat or it's on, it's on your mobile device or it's on Apple News or wherever it might be, and it could be in any one of those places and more. We want to make sure that label follows it wherever it goes.
Thank you. Yes, please.
My name is Jim Gookert, and my question is for Mr. Baquet. Would you comment on the James O'Keefe video and explain to us whether you believe his work is investigative journalism or not?
I think do people know, I think his work is not investigative journalism.
Would you
Explain who it
explain?
is, yeah.
James O'Keefe is a guy who happens to be conservative, who goes out and tries to trick journalists into saying inappropriate things, and then he puts them on his website. A journalist has to have at his heart or her heart a desire to make society better. All James O'Keefe is trying to do is hurt institutions and get some clicks. He just did a video about it that I think, I used the word before, I use it again, was despicable. He managed to trick a very young videographer, not even a very young employee of the video unit of the New York Times into saying some outlandish things because he was a young guy who wanted to have a conversation with a woman. He said he was Jim Comey's godson. He said he was the gatekeeper of video at the New York Times. He made all kinds of outlandish claims. He was a kid. What James O'Keefe did in jeopardizing that kid's career was awful. I don't think it's journalism. I think it's just it's destructive, it's dishonest. He lied about who he was, his employees lied about who they were. No, I don't think that's journalism. Journalism has got to have some value at its core, some desire to make society better or better informed, and that's not that.
Thank you on that, too. Thank you. Yes, please.
Yes, I'm Charlie Clark with Government Executive Media Group. The Trump people would assume that the two newsrooms that you represent are peopled by a whole lot of liberal Democrats who did not vote for Trump. And I'm just wondering, how confident are you that you have a good diversity of political leanings in your newsrooms?
We don't ask. I mean, I'm sorry, we don't ask. I'm not going to ask. I never will ask. There's no litmus test. I interview pretty much every job candidate who comes through the Post, and I've done the same at the Boston Globe and at the Miami Herald, and in a lot of instances at the LA Times as well. And I never asked. I never will ask. I know that people come from a lot of different backgrounds. You know, this notion that people are only coming from the coasts, that are only part of the elite, that's just a complete myth. You know, our deputy national editor she grew up on a farm in western Pennsylvania. Her brother still runs the farm. We have one of the individuals who covers healthcare for us. She grew up in a family of 12 kids. She was homeschooled. She went to Wheaton College, which is an evangelical Christian school. Her roommate also works for us, covering religion. So we have a wide variety of people with different backgrounds, and that's what I look for. One thing that we've endeavored to do is to hire more vets into the Post as well. We want to continue at that. I think that's a really important thing for us to do, given that the country has been at war for so long. I think that's clearly part of the American experience. It used to be that a lot of people in newsrooms had been in the military because there was a draft, but there hasn't been a draft in a very long time. And so I think now we need to make sure that that we bring vets into our newsrooms, and we're endeavoring to do that. And I think the Times is endeavoring to do that too. Yeah. So that is, I think that's important, is to have a variety of backgrounds. Whatever their political views are, that's their own business. I'm not going to ask them. They can go into the voting booth in privacy and cast their vote however they wish.
Thank you on that, Marty. We've got a little more than 5 minutes to go, so please shorten up the questions a bit and the answers. Go ahead, please.
That's for Dean. Sorry.
This will be brief. My name is Eric Meltzer. I'm a member of the Board of Governors here at the Press Club. I'm pleased to hear that the pendulum is leaning towards readership for revenue instead of advertisements. However, why are there sometimes articles or sections in your paper from Chinese media that don't always meet the same high standard of journalism that we hold here in the U.S.?
I think you're talking about us. So we have an advertorial section, clearly labeled as such, that is from China Daily. So that was a decision made by the business side, and it's clearly labeled as advertising. It's not labeled as news, and you should consider it to be advertising. So.
Okay, thank you, please.
So my name's Joshua Leach. I'm a student at St. Norbert College. One of the things that's really kind of getting into the nature of the new media age is compartmentalization. People are able to pick and choose the news that they get. So how do you sift through the noise of all of that and all of the fake news or otherwise to get your message out to the readers?
I think I'll be short. I think Marty addressed that earlier a little bit. I think part of it is doing things like this. Part of it is talking about who our reporters are. Some of it is, people have a certain mythology about who runs America's papers. Marty's from Tampa, I'm from New Orleans. I think that it's just letting people know that we're honorable people who make mistakes sometimes, but who have honorable goals and we hire veterans. We want newsrooms that look like America, and we want you to know it. I think that's the main thing.
Thank you, Dean. Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Gail Rubin. My question is, how do you view the press's coverage of candidate Trump, and how might we avoid re-electing him in the next go-round based on all that free coverage?
Well, look, the choice of who to elect is up to the American people, okay? So our job is to give people, the citizens of the United States, the information they need and deserve to know. I think that I'm proud of our coverage. I think Dean is proud of his coverage at the New York Times. I think we investigated pretty much every aspect of Donald Trump's life and career. That said, there were networks that carried him live, all of those rallies, without saying what was true or false for hours on end, largely because of the ratings. I don't happen to believe that was the right thing to do, is to carry him uninterrupted rally after rally after rally. What I think we failed, and I think the press in general failed, was what we didn't do before Donald Trump ever became a candidate. Once he became a candidate, we took him very seriously as a candidate and did those investigations that I just talked about. But before he was a candidate, I think we should have done a better job of writing about the level of anxiety and grievance that existed in vast swaths of the United States. And we should have brought that more to the fore. We needed to do a better job of listening to all of America, and we're determined to do that going forward.
Terrific. Yes, please.
My name's Elliot Haywood. I'm a freshman at GW, and I'm currently working on a paper on how print journalism and radio journalism can increasingly attract millennials to their traditional sources of journalism. And I was wondering, what are the Times and the Post doing, number one, in terms of data analytics, what does your data say in terms of how many of your new readers are millennials, number one, and number two, what are you guys doing other than increased presence on social media and online publications? What are you guys doing in the future to kind of stay relevant?
I mean, there are areas of coverage, speak for the New York Times, there are areas of coverage that I think you can make yourself nuts, by the way, chasing every sort of demographic group. But there are areas of, I think that, traditional news organizations are read more by men than by women, and I think that's partly a reflection of the people who run them and the people who write for them. I think diversifying your staff helps. I think we just started a gender vertical with the idea that we want, and we've done the same with a race vertical, that there's some subjects that were not present enough in our pages, that we needed to get present in our pages, and they actually are starting to draw audiences those are just examples, audiences that we didn't necessarily have before.
I'll say, our audience, and it's pretty close to the New York Times, is about a third of our audience is millennials, by the way. And we have something now called The Lily, which is targeted essentially at millennial women. It's been quite successful. And when Jeff Bezos took us over, acquired us, one of the things we thought about, in addition to thinking about how do we become more national, was how do we appeal to younger people? Because if we don't have younger people reading us, we won't have a readership in the future. And so we have a blog about internet culture, which people are interested in. We have a blog about the environment, which younger people are keenly interested in. So we've done a lot of things along those lines.
All of which, by the way, make our journalism better, period, for everybody.
Absolutely.
They're not done in a way that panders to readers. I think we understand that there are things we weren't covering that would draw other readers, but actually we should be covering.
We've got time for just one more question. So I apologize to the people who will not have a chance here. And there's just one here. Please.
Hi. My name is Alexis Kloiber. I'm a student at Loyola University of Chicago, and my question is in regards to investigative reporting. Both of your papers have released shocking exposés on Harvey Weinstein and the DEA recently, and my question has to do with how do your journalists overcome the challenges you've discussed tonight to really produce such gripping stories, and what is the overall impact of these exposés on how the general views you afterwards?
I mean, the Harvey Weinstein story the reaction has been probably 3 times what I anticipated. I think it's the result of Bill O'Reilly and even some of the coverage of Donald Trump during the campaign. I mean, how do you do it? That is like old-fashioned banging on doors, convincing people to talk, trying to get them to give you documents. It's the same stuff I did as an investigative reporter a long time ago. And my job as an editor is give them the time, make sure that they understand I truly value it, and just get the hell out of the way and support them when they do it, which, by the way, would have been the answer in 1977 when I started.
Marty, you want to add something?
Look, I mean, I'll just address the issue of how our readers respond to that. I mean, I agree with everything that Dean said, but readers really value it. I mean, really value it. When we do a great investigative piece, we see a tremendous response from our readers. They're thankful. I saw this at the Boston Globe and at the Miami Herald as well when I worked there, is that they say, thank you for doing this work. If there weren't newspapers, this wouldn't be done. This is why we need to support quality journalism. This is why I support you. And we need to keep doing this kind of work, and we need to keep reminding the public that this is something that we do more than anybody else and better than anybody else, and that if we weren't there, this work would not be done.
We are out of time, and I just want to thank all of you again for being here, for your questions. And I just want to say to our 2 guests that I cannot express my gratitude adequately for the fact that you took the time to be with us. I have enormous respect and admiration for the 2 of you and for the institutions that you represent and for the broader sense of the concept of a free press, which you both advocate big time and powerfully. And I think we're all very grateful to you and the work that you do.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much for being here. Good night.